Well, good morning, everyone. I think the topic of my presentation is around trying to figure out what's going on behind this disruption in ecosystems that we have, and in particular, what does cloud, SDN APIs, big data, mobile, all these, these terms that we use in the industry, how do they all coalesce and form, a real quake, I think, that's occurring in terms of how are we going to make money moving forward? How do we, as a telecom industry, make money? And so to do that, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. And these aren't personal stories. These are conversations that I've had with colleagues, people like Sam Ramji at Apogee, Jason Hoffman over at Joyent. And collectively, I think they help to create a thread that pulls a lot of these different ideas together. So if you stick with me, they're all going to make sense in the end, but these are metaphors. So take a look at the form of it as opposed to the detail. So the first story is about the garment industry in 1910. And we're going to go in the Wayback Machine and shift to black and white. This is the extent of my stagecraft today, so enjoy it while it comes. So in 1910, business was mostly direct. And this is a picture of the garment industry in New York City. And you can see that all of what you need to basically sell garments is vertically integrated. You've got the means of production, you've got the retail outlet, you've got the workers, they're all housed in this vertically integrated unit. And this is a very popular model. And so by the 1930s, there was a lot of competition. Right? And you can see this is a picture of the garment industry in the mid-1930s. It's a very popular mode of really retailing. But after World War II, things changed. The GI Bill came in, and people got low-cost mortgages. They moved to the suburbs. Right? This was a pretty significant change in the era of retail. And this actually became very successful. So by the 1950s, a lot of people were moving and living in the suburbs. And in fact, not many people were living in the cities anymore. And in fact, so many people were living in the suburbs that no one was buying at these vertically integrated retail chains anymore. They were buying from places like Sears. So no one was really participating in this new, this old economy. In fact, you don't see this economy today. You see the Sears and the Walmarts and the Best Buys. This is a popular model, so things changed. Things shifted pretty dramatically because of this new environmental pressure that was introduced. So a lot of businesses died out, and businesses went from direct to indirect. So you're no longer in this vertically integrated system. You're moving and you're selling your wares indirectly through these big retailers, right? And it went beyond the corner store. So the telecom world, in fact, is going from direct to indirect. Right? It's going beyond the subscriber. And we feel this. We see this in a saturated market like we have in North America, where CTI says we're 103% saturated. I think in terms of unique subscriptions, we're at least 80% saturated. And what we're seeing is that from a telecom provider perspective, where at the turn of the millennium, 15% of revenues came from new subscribers. In 2012, somewhere around less than 5% is coming from new subscribers. So we're looking at a different paradigm. In fact, what we see as the growth vector in the industry is around connected devices. And one of the sizable contributors to connected devices are things like e-readers and tablets, which in themselves are indirect, right? Because you're not buying directly from now the provider, whether it's AT&T or Sprint, you're buying from Amazon, and this particular tablet happens to have cellular connectivity behind it. I think the second big piece, when you take a look at things going beyond subscribers, is around APIs. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through. Okay? So let's shift gears and go to my second story. So put that in the back of your head and just let it linger there for a second. Okay? I'm going to go back to blue for this. So in the 1960s, this man, this is William Baumol, he created something that became known as Baumol's disease, Baumol's cost disease. And he's actually recently reprinted some of this material in a new book that came out in October. And I'm not giving a big dig for that, but it's a great book if you want to read it. And the basic idea is that no matter how innovative we are with technology and in organizing our work, it still takes a pianist 23 minutes to play a Mozart sonata, and a first grade teacher 13 minutes to read Green Eggs and Ham. It takes me about 20 for my son, as he reminds me as he goes to bed, he needs that 20, 30 minutes. So while we have production gains and commoditization in manufacturing and high tech, there's little productivity growth in verticals like healthcare and education. So these services industries seem to continually increase in terms of what their costs are. And the theory behind this is there's a lot of economic black magic that that sits behind it, but effectively it's a force of wage equalization, where the productivity gains that you make in one side of the sector allows some of the workers to actually claim some of that profit. And then because they actually gain wages and are able to buy more things, the folks in low productivity sectors basically get some leverage power because they need to have salaries paid for that are competitive with the industry. So you see wage equalization, and so low productivity areas tend to increase in scale, whereas these high productivity areas gain more and more and more in terms of commoditization. So in fact, the cost of these services steadily climb. And effectively, goods can become commoditized, while services are just getting more expensive. So how does that apply to telecom? Let me tie it together. So voice is commoditizing. This is a reality, right? The S curve of commoditization as a function of service penetration. I spoke about how we're around 103% saturated in terms of cellular. You can see that over time, the minutes of use and the cost of that has really declined pretty steadily, pretty dramatically as service penetration's increased. And data access is commoditizing. You wouldn't think of that because by the end of this year, we should probably have 80 billion in terms of data revenues in the mobile operator space. But what we're actually seeing is that the price per megabyte of data has halved almost every year, while data consumption has actually increased. And the good part about this is that it's increasing faster than it's commoditizing. And so we're seeing value, right? So however, while basic telecom services are reaching these utility levels, we're seeing using voice and data access to deliver new finished services is on the rise. And so it's less about the subscription and more about the value creation. And so if you can create value and attack some of these services, you can actually create new revenue pools for yourselves, right? This is a great example. I thought I'd pick something that's a little obscure, a company called Harquin. And what they've done is they've taken this commodity voice call, this 10-cent voice call, and by actually taping people's interviews and making that queryable and indexable in a large database, it allows you to basically pay a particular fee and get what's the most interesting question asked during a job interview. And in fact, you can get the best answer too. And so what they've done is they've taken this 10-cent voice call and they've created a $10 asset. And that's kind of how this works at the end of the day. So these services depend on voice and data being commoditized so that they can actually take these piece parts, combine them, and make these interesting new value services that people are willing to pay a lot more money for. So how do you put the pieces together? So if you look at the top, this is what the direct model looks like, and this is the one that we all understand, right? You have a telco and a retail store, and you sell data plans and voice plans to users, and you subsidize their handset. But really this indirect model that I'm talking about that takes into these commoditized components of voice and data, and it moves and it shifts from going to the subscriber to go indirectly to the subscriber by the telco selling some of these assets, these APIs, to developers, and those developers creating apps, and those apps ultimately being sold to a consumer. And this value chain is very different than what we're used to as a community. And it really will require a lot of changes. If you think about the garment industry and how it changed from direct to indirect, it was massively difficult for people to compete in this ecosystem. It was very strange for someone in the garment industry in New York to be handing out handbills in Poughkeepsie. That never happened. All the advertising and retailing happened in that little store. And so by the same token, this is going to change up our industry as well, because things are going to shift from being direct to indirect. Marketing is going to have to be changed, right? Now, I guess the question, when we put this in the context of Boehmel's disease, is what could happen if we could reduce the cost of delivering the service? Because this is a pretty key profit pool. If really the cost of providing these services and creating these new values, really starts to increase year over year, what if I can actually burst that bubble? What if I can actually start to drain that profit pool and attack it? And that would really bring an order of magnitude change. And that brings us to the third story. That's cloud. So a lot of people talk about cloud, and the big question is always, what is cloud? And everybody has their own token definitions of what it is, right? This is a little cloud tag of cloud, in fact, that I pulled together from a couple of different conversations, and it's meaningful to a certain degree, and I think it captures most of the buzzwords that you probably are familiar with. But really the question is, what is it? And so this is what Nist defines cloud computing as. And you can see at the bottom, there's a number of different deployment models, whether it's a public cloud, something like Amazon Web Services, private clouds, which is really what the enterprises are cooking up in terms of being able to deliver internal efficiencies. Hybrid cloud, which is kind of, I have my private cloud, and every now and then I'm going to go into the public cloud or community clouds. And then you have service models, software as a service, which is, something like a Salesforce.com, which is, I think, really the poster child for software as a service today. Platform as a service, which is like a Microsoft Azure, or what Google is doing with App Engine. And infrastructure as a service, which is, again, something like what Amazon Web Services is, or Rackspace, right? And this is how we've kind of come to terms and describe what cloud is. And of course, the missing element of cloud is all about where's the money. So inevitably, what everybody always tells me when I talk about cloud is, oh, that's just like the mainframe. And certainly there's design patterns of what the mainframe looks like. But I think what's happening is that we're thinking about cloud today the same way we thought about the internet back in 1995. That if only it would go away so we can sell this other thing that we've got. Well, cloud is not about Amazon. It's not about Google. It's not about Rackspace. So what is it? To me, just like the internet, the cloud is simply how we're going to deliver services and how we're reaching the customer. And that's what the cloud really represents, right? This is my little simple icon that I pulled together to describe what cloud is. And it is an indirect model. So what's wrong with how we deliver services today? And that's always a question. Why would I go to a cloud? What does it intrinsically deliver to me, right? Well, today, the way we deliver services is very complex. There's, how many engineers are in the room? Put your hands up. Right, and engineers love complexity, right? We're very good at really starting to create very complex structures in order to deliver something. I was on a 747 with a friend the other day, and he was looking at this little pamphlet, and it says, all these thousands and thousands of moving parts on this plane all come together to deliver you safely to your destination. Doesn't that make you feel confident? 7,000 different pieces. Because we intrinsically know, I think as engineers, that as things become complex, it becomes more difficult to manage. And that difficulty to manage things obviously keeps our careers in check. To deliver services today, we need to be masters of complexity. It would be much simpler if we could extract simplicity, right? Now, this is another question like asking people, how many people drive a stick shift? Hands up. Right? See, you guys like complexity. I drive an automatic. It's a lot easier. Simplicity actually, it gets delivered through abstractions, innovation and automation. I'm going to put a highlight on each of these words, but I think they're important for us to embrace. Right? Abstraction lowers complexity. Just put your shoulder behind that one for a second. When you abstract things out, you actually lower complexity. Right? This is kind of a little history of my life as a software programmer. Way back, I used to code to the CPU machine language, and I used to have something very directed towards whatever type of processing or DSP I was using. And then I was able to abstract from the CPU. I didn't really have to worry about the complexity of the CPU because I had an operating system. And so I could code to the operating system and not really worry about the CPU underneath it. And then when you kind of go to a cloud, it really becomes an order of magnitude shift in terms of abstraction just again, where I'm actually abstracting all these servers. And I'm actually able to code for the cloud, right? And so these are levels of abstractions that have occurred, and they've actually made things much more simpler for us. When you move to a cloud, I don't have to do unique installs. I can orchestrate all these things. I can spawn and kill processes very quickly as I need capacity and storage. That's what the cloud delivers for you. It abstracts all that complexity. And SDN, which is kind of bedmates, I think, with cloud, is really starting to abstract the complexity of what the network is. And that's making it easier and easier. So we're abstracting complexity. So lowering complexity, and this is also important to understand, speeds innovation. If I can make something less complex, more people can use it, and suddenly innovation occurs, right? And that's the magic brew that allows innovation to occur and a lot of interesting things in our industry to happen, right? And this is, don't kind of linger on the actual quantitative view of this, but what this is a log curve. Back in the old days, I used to use semi-log to describe technology, and it would be a linear curve. And what we're seeing is that this becomes an autocatalytic process. As things become easier, and I've extracted simplicity, and I've created this new platform, and I can build on top of it because more and more people can build on top of it and build using these complex machines that we have, they're able to create more and more innovations, and so innovation takes off. And there's a funny thing about innovation. I'll talk about that in a minute. So speeding innovation simplifies automation, right? And this is kind of the body math, and don't hold me to these numbers. These are logical guesses based on some information forensics that we have. But if you look at some carriers, they've got a number of sysadmins per server of around 1 to 500. And then Amazon is probably sitting around 1 sysadmin for 5,000 servers, and Google is 1 to 10,000. And this is how you're actually abstracting, simplicity inside a data center. And this is, in fact, one of the ways that we're able to kind of pop the revenue bubble that exists in some services, because I can actually create enough automation that I can deliver that service much more cheaply through cloud, right? So automation lowers cost, right? And this shows you a view based on Randy Bias at Cloud Scaling, a view on what would it take in terms of, or rather, what kind of cost savings would you incur in terms of just your IT headcount over 5 years by implementing software automation in a cloud. And based on some statistics around what the pay is for a particular IT professional to manage some of these services. Right, and in fact, what also is occurring, coming back to this notion of commoditization, is that what we see in the cloud is that the actual network elements are starting to commoditize. Right? And so those network elements, and this is a fractal kind of meme, I guess, is that these network elements commoditize, they get wrapped around this cloud, and the cloud itself delivers commoditized services to an end user. Right? And we're seeing, terrifyingly so for network vendors, of which I am part of, that cost per ports, cost per servers, all coming down. Right? So lowering costs means I can do it cheaper. And cheaper services is a cure for Beaumont's disease. And this is a pretty important thing, because now if you can attack that, you're really starting to create a different scenery, different landscape, different ecosystem and value chain for yourselves in terms of how are we going to really kind of compete in this landscape moving forward. Now, when this happens, it's going to shift the industry profit pool. And this is one of these things that you really need to pay attention to as you're members of this industry, right? And not everybody's going to be prepared for this. And I'm going to go back to this curve, but I think it's interesting to look at. Because when I look at a log-log curve, and I think about semi-log curves, and I think, well, why am I plotting it that way? It's because if you plot it on a linear scale, it looks something like that, right? It means it doesn't mean anything to people, right? It could look like an S-curve or something else. But effectively what it meant is that if you're in the middle of that transition, things look really, really confusing, because things are changing at an order of magnitude. I'm not taking my current reality and linearly extrapolating it to find out what is the new state of the industry. There's an order of magnitude change that happened. Back when I was growing up, everybody talked about the year 2000 as being the future, right? And then, in the 80s, and I was, kind of getting a little bit more, my mind wrapped around technology and things, we still talked about the year 2000. And in the 90s, it was still the year 2000. So effectively what happened is that, for every year that I lived, the future shrank by 1 year. And the reason why that happened is people understood intuitively that something big is going to happen. I can't just take today and linearly extrapolate it and find out what's going to happen beyond the year 2000, because an order of magnitude change is going to happen. And that's kind of where we're at today, and I think that's why it's very confusing when we try to evaluate where is the business going to and where's the money going, right? Remember Kodak? Kodak is a great, I think, case study of what happens when order of magnitude change occurs, right? This is Kodak way back in 1995 when they had pretty decent profit, and I think because they had Kodak film and they owned the camera technology, they had a pretty strong hold on the industry. And then something happened. Digital came about. Now, it's not that Kodak didn't understand that. They had a digital camera back in 1975, and they knew that that would attack 70% of the profit of the film industry. And so they were a little tentative about attacking this new industry. They didn't want to burst their profit bubble. But digital camera came around, and they did it anyway, right? And so today you have a total profit of $3.7 billion, and the profit pool is shifted to someplace else, right? And this is happening today. This is happening in our industry, right? This is kind of a very high-level view of what the mobile ecosystem looked like in 2011, right? And you see that these new players are winning at the expense of the incumbents, and they're draining the profit pool, right? They're shifting profits from one segment to the next, right? There's a lot of collateral damage that occurs because the old industry players, they're being attacked, and it's their profits that are being attacked. And then what's happening is that this whole ecosystem is starting to encroach on other areas like mobile gaming and other areas of the vertical ecosystem, right? This is an interesting concept that was introduced to me, and it's an evolutionary topic. It's called Punctuated Equilibrium. I don't know if any one of you are familiar with evolutionary theory in this particular terminology, but it was explained to me that evolution occurs in these big spurts. Order of magnitude change occurs, and it's very difficult to really pace it at a linear scale, right? And when that guy told me that story, I said, oh, you mean like the X-Men. So if you guys are familiar with the X-Men comics, this is the scientific principle behind it. But punctuated equilibrium, this is what's happening to us. And it only looks gradual if you're losing. Thank you.
So I understood everything you said, but there are a couple of key questions that still are not obvious to me.
Sure.
Does that mean, as an operator, as a mobile operator, particularly in the 4G domain, do I have to build a cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there's, when I look at cloud, I think there's going to be room for a lot of different players. But I think the big limitation that you have today in a public cloud, for instance, like Amazon Web Services, is that it doesn't really choreograph the network with the actual, compute in storage, right? So I'll give you a great example. Enterprise is trying to, outsource their IT to a cloud provider like, let's say, Rackspace or something like that. They shift all their traffic from east to west inside, their enterprise boundaries to north to west, because now they need, a private line to be able to consume all these new storage and servers that they're buying. And so now they need to put this big 10 gig pipe in place. And so the cost is shifted from all their IT infrastructure to this 10 gig pipe that they got to buy and lease on a monthly basis. If you could orchestrate the delivery of that bandwidth in concert with the compute and storage, then I think you've started to hit a sweet spot. And so to your point, I think operators play a very dominant role in being able to orchestrate the bandwidth assets with the actual server and storage assets. They could do both, and some will just do one.
Mm-hmm. And so let's assume for a moment I don't build that and I decide not to get into that business. Mm-hmm. How do I then become the cloud enabler that gets my value positioning properly so it doesn't leak out to everybody else?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think if you're an operator that chooses, I'm not going to do any of that, how do I take my assets today and I actually enable some of these cloud players? And that's where these network APIs come into play. And when I talked about this direct to indirect, if you could take your voice, your data assets, and really expose those as APIs so that you create a bridge between yourself and where value is being created today, let's say a Facebook or an Amazon, now that cloud player is taking assets from the network and then delivering them back down to the consumer. And so an operator can take this telco 2.0 kind of model in order to reap some of the profits that are being available in cloud.
So let's take some examples. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Facebook, but I'm not sure Facebook needs much help here. Maybe they need help mobilizing their application and getting people not to use mobile broadband to go to Facebook's website, but instead have something that's an app-based Facebook that is a little more efficient, a little more effective. Right. Maybe that's something they're working on. Obviously, they've been trying to get that to come to market quickly. Mm-hmm. But I think there are a lot of other similar kinds of capabilities that are further out in terms of maturity and adoption that, in fact, operators can become the enabler for and can become the cloud provider for, at least in the mobile domain. Right. Particularly within the countries in which they are a major player. So, in fact, if I'm a big service provider in Germany and I can enable these apps to work effectively in my market, then I'm probably going to do a pretty good job there, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things that are conflated there. I think that there's the local app economy, which I think, within the geographic coverage of a franchise, there is value that an operator can bring. I think the other one is really this notion that what can an operator provide to a Facebook, and I use those terms loosely, just as metaphors. Don't hold me to Facebook. But when I look at them, I like to think about the economic theory of complements, right? So what Google does is that they have a bunch of stuff that they give away for free, as a for instance, but AdSense is what they lock in. That's where they make all their money. And the idea is that all this other stuff goes away, you consume it, but fundamentally it drives revenue to AdSense. So Facebook similarly has, a theory of complements in terms of what is their core that drives their revenue and what doesn't. right? Applications don't necessarily drive Facebook revenue. They drive eyeballs to their platforms, and eyeballs to their platforms allows them to charge for ads, right? So when I look at that, as a business, you have to make an assessment about, well, what am I going to give away to the operator? You're not going to give away ads to the operator. That's probably not going to happen. But why wouldn't an operator take over the identity? Why wouldn't an operator take over real-time communication services on behalf of Facebook? So I think that when you put those segments together and you glue and you find out what's your core domain, what are the things that you give away to drive revenue, that there is actually an equilibrium that can take place between over-the-top and operators.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions for Vish? So I have one last question.
All right.
Where does Ericsson fit into that puzzle? Why is Ericsson talking about this topic and making it their keynote for 4G World?
Well, I think, as a player in the ecosystem, we obviously have a parochial, view towards what's going to happen towards where value and where money is created because we want to participate in it. But I think, I see 4G and wireless in particular as a new medium for being able to access these cloud capabilities, right? And I think understanding how the value is going to be created on top of the bandwidths and the pipes that we're actually deploying in the industry is very important because we need to be able to capture value as well. So understanding how do I do elastic bandwidth management and tying that to cloud services, right? Understanding, in fact, how do I do real-time services over cloud, which is kind of the bailiwick of Ericsson, because I don't think that there's really a structure out there that allows you to deliver real-time services, voice and video effectively over cloud, especially when it's coupled with a mobile front end, right? So I think we're participating in a lot of different technologies to create superhighways between clouds and the mobile infrastructure, and whether it's through some of our mobile cloud accelerator products, whether it's through hooks that we're putting in our radio access network to be able to deliver cloud-based services across it. Those are the things that we think are going to be areas that Ericsson will participate from an ecosystem perspective.
Terrific. I guess with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Thanks very much.